Hi guys, let's keep learning about William Penn and his ideas for government in Pennsylvania. So yesterday we talked about how Penn established Pennsylvania, how he wanted a safe place for Quakers to practice their religion freely, but that he also opened things up to not just Quakers, but to people of all belief systems, to people of any background. So that made his colony unique because other colonies were only for one religion. So colonies like Massachusetts for the Puritans, or Maryland was a colony that was established for people of the Catholic religion. Pennsylvania was a place for all people, and that made Pennsylvania very unique. Pennsylvania's government. And we're on page 28 if you're following along in the ebook. Pennsylvania's government. And our main idea here is that Pennsylvania colonists were given many important rights. Okay. William Penn once wrote, "Governments, like clocks, go from the motion men give them." He meant that he wanted colonists to be part of their government. Now, governments like clocks go from the motion men give them. Let's break down that quote for a minute, because a clock, you have to think about a clock in 1680. A clock was wound by a person. You had to wind that clock every day in order for the clock to keep time correctly. Or in the case of certain types of clocks, there's chains that you pull with weights. So whichever the case was, you didn't have clocks that were running on batteries. Clocks had to be very carefully created. The gears had to be just right so that it kept accurate time. And so the idea governments, like clocks, go from the motion men give them. That was a new idea for the Quakers, or for people at this time, because England, common people didn't have a say in their government. But William Penn believed they should. He believed regular people were really the ones who powered the government. So Penn meant that he wanted colonists to be part of their government. Penn set up an assembly of representatives. This type of assembly is a group of people who come together to make laws. Now, we have assemblies at school all the time. If you think about what is an assembly, well, an assembly is when people gather together, okay, for some common purpose. We have an assembly for Kids Heart Challenge. We have an assembly for the end of the year. We have awards assemblies. So we have these different gatherings. But we also have a representative assembly at school. We don't call it a representative assembly, okay? But you elect representatives. We elect representatives to serve on student council. And those representatives speak on our behalf. So we can't have a meeting with all 550 people at school to decide what kind of spirit day we're going to have, to decide that it's going to be, Twin Day or Crazy Hair Day. So what we need to do instead is we need to have a few people talk that over, and they can kind of speak on our behalf. So when you have an idea, you say, hey, to your student council rep, could you share this at the next student council meeting and see if it's something we should do for the school? And then the student council representatives will all talk about it, along with the student council advisors. So that's a representative assembly. You have people that are speaking on your behalf. And that's what William Penn wanted for his colony. He didn't want one person. He didn't want to be the one to make all the rules. He wanted to hear the ideas of others. Colonists elected people to represent them in the assembly. The representatives could approve or veto suggested laws. Veto means to reject or not to approve. And our president and our governors still have that power today. If they don't like the laws that the assembly came up with, or that Congress came up with in the case of the president, then they can veto those laws. They can say, no, I still don't think that's a good idea. And then what happens next is that Congress or the assembly can override that veto with even more votes. So if they have enough people saying, no, we think you're wrong, governor, or no, we think you're wrong, president, then they can still make that a law. So it takes a lot of people and a lot of steps to kind of make all this happen. And you'll be learning more about that as you continue through school as well. In 1682, the Assembly created a series of laws known as the Great Law. The Great Law outlined the rules Pennsylvanians would be expected to follow. It allowed colonists to choose their own religion and to worship freely. So those were two of the main components of that great law, that every colonist living in Pennsylvania would be able to pick their own religion, that there would not be an official religion for this colony, and that you were free to worship however you believed. In 1701, so about 20 years later, Penn wrote the Charter of Privileges. The charter, remember, charter is an official document that tells how something should be done. The Charter of Privileges allowed the assembly to suggest new laws. Penn also worked to build a new city which he named Philadelphia. The word Philadelphia comes from a Greek word meaning brotherly love. He organized the city streets as a grid. A grid is a series of straight lines that crisscross one another and form squares. This plan influenced the design of many cities throughout the colony. Now, I want to take a look at a couple cities, including Philadelphia, and I want to kind of show you that grid system. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's take a look at Philadelphia, and let's compare it to some of the cities in Europe.
Okay, so let's take a look at the grid system that William Penn designed for the streets of Philadelphia. Now, obviously, this is modern Philadelphia. This isn't Philadelphia of the early 1700s, but it does show us kind of how things were laid out. So if you look at these streets, when we talk about a grid, we're kind of talking about those crisscrossing lines. And I'm sorry, I'm trying to draw with the mouse here, so my lines aren't exactly perfect. But if you look, you can kind of see those streets and how we have streets running parallel to each other, to use some of our math terms. And then there are other streets that run perpendicular to those. So what that does is it makes it very easy to navigate through a city like this. It makes it easy to get from one place to another. Oh, that one went really wiggly. But a street system like this makes it easy. Now we have some other streets, some more random streets that just kind of go off at some different angles to kind of cut your way through. But overall, we have that grid system throughout the city of Philadelphia. And if I clear those out, let's see here. My controls are behind my head here. There we go. Okay. But it's like that all through Philadelphia. No matter where we go here, it has that nice, neat, organized system. Okay? And Philadelphia isn't the only city in the United States that's set up that way. But Penn was kind of the first one to organize a city in that style. If we go to New York City, we'll see something quite similar, actually, that was taken and used there. Zoom out enough to find New York up the coast here. There we go. So in New York, we see something very, very similar, actually. So this is New York City. Manhattan, and we have those streets in that parallel perpendicular grid set up as well. So we see something very similar, and again, easy to get around. We have this one street that kind of goes diagonally and not quite following that pattern, and that street is probably one of the most famous streets in the world. It is Broadway. So Broadway is kind of the street that goes diagonally up through New York, but other than that, those streets are in a very neat, organized grid system. Over there's Madison Square Garden, if you've heard of that. The Empire State Building's around here somewhere too. Chrysler Building, Times Square. Since I turned street names, oh, there it is. Okay, so that's the Empire State Building. Okay. And we'll go one more a little closer to home. And let's go to Altoona. So even if we come to a much, much smaller city like Altoona, we have, again, that grid design. So what William Penn thought of and wanted to use for his city of Philadelphia, many other cities liked that idea and did something very similar. So in Altoona, it's not the entire city this way, but there are definitely sections of the city where they use that grid system, and it's very, very clear to see that here. Okay. If we go even into Duncansville, down the road here, let's see, I think that's Penn Farms area. And there we are. There's downtown Duncansville. And once again, if we just kind of straighten this up a little bit, you can see that grid system even closer to home there. I think that's Dairy Queen. Am I right about that? I don't know. No, I'm not right. There's Pizza Hut. Yep. So Dairy Queen is actually down this way. There's Best Way. So, oh, there's Dairy Queen. Okay, so this is an area you're maybe a little more familiar with. And again, we have that grid system in place for our streets. We have avenues running one direction, we have streets running the other, and that forms that grid. Now, let's go quickly here and compare that to some of the areas in Europe. Okay, so if we go to London, where William Penn had spent some time, oh, not London, Pennsylvania. Oh, was used to typing Pennsylvania. London in the United Kingdom. And there we go. Okay. Now, London is a much older city. But if we zoom in on the streets here in London, now over time they have made some improvements to make this a little easier as well, and it's adopted some parts of that grid system. But if you look at the roads here, they're kind of going all over the place. We've got roads going in all directions. Look over here. Wow. Okay. So you can imagine it would be really challenging to kind of find your way around if the roads looked like this or like this. It's kind of like a maze or a spider web almost compared to what we saw in William Penn's Philadelphia. Uh, and London isn't alone like that. If we travel across Europe, and we go to Paris, so across the English Channel. See, I think that's Paris. Absolutely enormous city there. But again, look at this road system. It's hard to even imagine finding your way around there. You would really have to know what you were doing. Now, I can't bring you to Paris and not show you the Eiffel Tower, so I will do that as soon as I find it. But look at these roads. Holy cow. So you can really see what William Penn was trying to achieve when he constructed Philadelphia, planned Philadelphia with that organized street system. He really knew what he wanted to do because of what he had seen elsewhere. There's the Arc de Triomphe, very famous landmark. Take a look at that while we're here. And spin us around. There we go. You've probably seen that before. But where is the Eiffel Tower? Whoops. I'll turn that off. There we go. There it is. Okay. So there we have the Eiffel Tower. But again, the street system here as well, even by that famous landmark, we have streets kind of going in all different directions. Okay. And we'll go to one more city. Let's see. Let's go to Italy. Go to the city of Florence. Very old city in Italy. And again, we have all these beautiful red terracotta roofs that are a big feature of Italy. And of this town in particular. But once again, we've got kind of streets that aren't really in a straight, parallel, perpendicular design. They're in more of that zigzag spiderweb pattern like we saw in London, in Paris, where we kind of have streets going in all different directions. So you can see what William Penn was thinking. You can see why he wanted to make sure that his city was different. His city was more organized and easier to get around, and that's continued to this day. So we have William Penn to thank for a lot of that.
All right, and let's read a little bit more about William Penn out of my other William Penn book, and let's continue the story there, and we'll talk more about Philadelphia and the establishment of the city of Philadelphia, along with some of his ideas like the Great Law and the Charter of Privileges. The city of brotherly love. Penn saw Pennsylvania as a great experiment. He believed that people living and worshiping freely would succeed, and he was right. People from many faiths brought many skills to the colony, and Pennsylvania grew quickly. Its capital city was Philadelphia, which means brotherly love. Now think about that name. Why would that name be appropriate for the Quaker people? Well, they believed everyone should treat one another as a brother, that nobody's above anyone else, that we're all equal, and that we're all friends. Okay? The Society of Friends was the other name for the Quakers. So they believed in treating one another fairly. So not like your brother if you're fighting with your brother all the time, but like brothers that get along as friends. Philadelphia was itself an experiment. It was the first planned city built in America, inspired by Penn's childhood in London. There, Penn had seen smallpox and plague kill thousands of people. He had nearly died of smallpox himself as a child, and he knew how quickly diseases spread through the crowded, twisting streets of London. In addition, the Great Fire of London had occurred in 1666. More than 13,000 homes had burned. The home of Penn's parents was almost one of them. So when Penn laid out his new city, he built wide, straight streets where homes would not be too close together. That would keep diseases and fire from spreading. Penn also insisted that houses be built of brick because brick houses could not catch fire as easily. So he had some pretty smart ideas based on his experiences. So he learned from the mistakes that had happened before, and he thought carefully about solutions that could make things better in his city. Penn's ideas. Philadelphia grew into a leading city in the colonies. It also led the fight for freedom for the United States. It served as the U.S. capital from 1790 to 1800. Two of the most important papers in history were written and signed there: the Declaration of Independence in 1776 and the United States Constitution in 1787. Both of these documents borrowed many of Penn's ideas. Penn declared that in Pennsylvania, government served the people. In England, the opposite was true. The people served the government, namely the king. As the owner of Pennsylvania, Penn could have been another ruler. He could have made all of the laws himself. Instead, he set up a legislature, a group that would speak for the people and create laws for the colony. He allowed many men to vote. Women and poor people were not allowed to vote. And of course, he made freedom of religion an important right. Penn also changed the rights of prisoners. Because he had spent so much time in filthy London prisons, where prisoners often starved, Penn made sure prisoners in Pennsylvania were treated better. In England, the death penalty was common, even for minor offenses. In Pennsylvania, only murder and treason led to death. Penn's ideas were ahead of their time. As early as the 1680s, he had imagined the uniting of the colonies. So he put forth a plan to create a council where problems among the colonies could be resolved. This idea sprang from problems between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Their disagreement had to be settled in England. Penn felt that neighboring colonies should be able to solve their own problems. Thomas Jefferson recognized the debt the new nation owed to William Penn. Now, this wasn't an actual debt like owing money to him, but he recognized the debt the nation owed to William Penn, basically recognized that William Penn had created a lot of the ideas that Thomas Jefferson and others would use to form the United States. Jefferson said that Penn was the greatest lawgiver the world has produced, the first, either in ancient or modern times, who has laid the foundation of government in the principles of peace, of reason, and of right. So pretty high praise from Thomas Jefferson. Okay, we will stop there and go back to our regular book. And let's talk about treaties with the American Indians. Penn wanted to gain more land for his colony. He also wanted to maintain peaceful relations with the American Indians in Pennsylvania. Much of the land in Pennsylvania was controlled by the Lenni Lenape. Between 1682 and 1701, Penn signed a number of treaties with Lenni Lenape groups. So over that 20-year period, he decided to enter into agreements with the Lenni Lenape. He also purchased some land from the Lenni Lenape. The treaties stated which land belonged to the American Indians and the price that colonists would pay them to buy land. Now keep in mind, William Penn did not have to pay them anything. The king had given this land to Penn. He could have come in, he could have said, okay guys, this land belongs to England, get out, keep moving, sorry, or you can stay here, but you're going to have to follow our laws and live your life our way. He didn't do that. He wanted to treat them fairly. He wanted to treat them as brothers because of his Quaker beliefs. So he had a different relationship with the native people than some of the leaders in other colonies that took a more strict approach to dealing with the native people. Treaties with the Lenni Lenape groups gave the colonists more land in Pennsylvania. So this book talks again a little more about the Lenni Lenape. Sadly, the government of the United States did not borrow another of Penn's ideas. Penn believed in fair treatment of the American Indians. An important Quaker belief was that all people were equal before God. So Penn held that the American Indians of his Pennsylvania colony were also equal. Other colonies viewed the native peoples as far below themselves. Penn insisted that the Indians living in Pennsylvania must be treated fairly. The native people in his colony were called the Lenni Lenape. Penn knew that getting Pennsylvania from the king did not make him an owner in the eyes of the Indians. So when he arrived in Penn's woods, he paid the Lenni Lenape for it. Then he signed a treaty with them. It is one of the few treaties ever signed with American Indians that was not soon broken. It became known as the Great Treaty. So other colonial leaders signed treaties, but they were lying. They signed treaties and then they broke the treaties right away, and there was really nothing the native people could do about it. Fair treatment of the Indians was written into the law. Disagreements between colonists and Lenni Lenape were to be settled fairly. A panel made up of 6 Lenni Lenape and 6 colonists would work together when there was a conflict. Most colonies had costly and bloody battles with the American Indians within their borders. Most of the native groups were killed or forced to move west, but Pennsylvanians lived in peace with the Lenni Lenape for almost 90 years. Slavery. And we'll be talking more about slavery in the next lesson, I believe, or maybe the second lesson from now. But later in this section, we'll be talking more about slavery. Pennsylvania also reflected the trouble the early United States had with the issue of slavery. It was against Quaker beliefs to own slaves, but many wealthier Quakers did so anyway. Penn owned slaves, and he freed them at his death. But Penn worried that forcing the end of slavery would doom his colony because the wealthy land and slave owners would revolt. Pennsylvania became the first colony to outlaw slavery, but slavery was legal in Pennsylvania until 1748. This was one of Penn's few failures. Home and abroad. In October 1682, when Penn first arrived in America, he was amazed by what he saw. He looked out on vast acres of forests full of birds and deer, and rivers and streams full of fish. He felt that he had found his home. Penn set up his colony and laid out the city of Philadelphia. He worked with colonists to write the rules for governing the colony. Then he chose a site just north of Philadelphia for his own home. He named the place Pennsbury, which is what I have behind me. Its front porch faced the Delaware River. He could only reach his house by boat. Meanwhile, the border problem continued between Pennsylvania and Maryland over the area that is now Delaware. Each colony claimed it. Penn had no choice but to go back to England. Penn had heard that Lord Baltimore of Maryland was secretly leaving for England. Baltimore was going to try to convince the king that Delaware belonged to Maryland. Penn didn't want Lord Baltimore to get there first. In August of 1684, he set sail for England too. Going back to England caused nothing but trouble for Penn. Charles II died in early 1685 before the border issue was decided. Penn was also friendly with Charles's successor, James II, but before he could persuade James in his favor, James was overthrown. Then Penn was accused of treason and put in jail for a time. The border of Delaware wasn't settled for decades. The new king and queen, William and Mary, increased religious persecution. Penn felt that he should stay in England, where Quakers were in danger. Pennsylvania, where religious freedom was guaranteed, would have to wait. It wasn't until September of 1699 that Penn returned to Pennsylvania. He hoped to live out his years there. He fixed up Pennsbury and settled in. He worked with the colonists to revise Pennsylvania's plan of government. But in November 1701, Penn headed back to England again. This time, England was trying to take Pennsylvania away from him. In England, Penn successfully defended his ownership of Pennsylvania, but he had no money left. He poured all of his money into the colony and had received very little back. In addition, the man who managed Penn's finances in England cheated Penn. Thousands of pounds, which were the unit of money in England, were owed or missing. Penn spent the rest of his life coping with these difficulties, and he never again returned to America. Penn died in England on July 30th, 1718, at the age of 73. The nation Penn would inspire with his words and deeds was still far from being born. But on November 28th, 1984, Penn and his wife Hannah were named honorary citizens of the United States. Only 3 other people, Winston Churchill, Raoul Wallenberg, and Mother Teresa, have ever received that honor. So even though he never lived in the United States, he is one of 4 people, basically 5 people, counting his wife, who has been named an honorary United States citizen, which is pretty remarkable. That's a pretty special honor reserved for just a few people. So I hope you enjoyed that look at Penn's life. We have one piece left in our main text about Hannah Penn. So let's read that, and it is on page 29. William Penn's second wife, Hannah Callowhill Penn, became an important leader in the colony. When Penn became ill in 1712, Hannah Penn took over many of his responsibilities. These included governing the colony. She led the colony for many years after her husband's death in 1718. Hannah Penn is considered to be the first woman leader of Pennsylvania, and we still have not elected a woman to be a governor in Pennsylvania. So Hannah Penn, very important lady in our Pennsylvania history, for her role at a time when women didn't have leadership positions in many cases. She took on a leadership role and was well respected here in Pennsylvania. Our lesson summary notes there say that Pennsylvania became a colony in 1681, that William Penn wanted people in the colony to have religious freedom and to be a part of their new government, and that Penn made agreements with the American Indians that gave the colonists more land. Why it matters? Well, Penn's ideas of government influenced the governments of other colonies and eventually of the United States of America. So we will stop there. That's the end of that lesson. Thanks so much as always for watching. I'll see you next time.